Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. As your professor, I am absolutely thrilled you're here with us. Today, we're going to lay out a thematic roadmap to help you navigate this week's chapter on American expansion. You know, history really isn't just about memorizing names and dates, right? It's about getting to the why and the how. So our main goal today is to look at the big picture. That way, when you actually sit down with the text later, all those little details will just naturally fall right into place. Okay, let's dive into this. So here is the thematic journey we'll be taking today. We're going to cover from frontier to empire, defining modern imperialism, the imperial justifications, ideals versus brutal realities, policing the Western Hemisphere, and finally, we'll wrap up with the big ideas to remember. All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, From Frontier to Empire, looking at the economic and philosophical causes. Now, one of the most important ideas you're going to encounter in this chapter is exactly how and why the United States shifted its focus from, conquering the continental West to suddenly looking overseas. There's this incredibly famous quote from historian Frederick Jackson Turner from 1893, claiming that the American frontier was officially closed. As you read, pay attention to how this thesis sparked immense anxiety across the country. Honestly, the claim was demonstrably false. More land was taken up after 1890 than before it. But Americans genuinely worried that without a frontier to expand into, their democratic institutions and the economic safety valve of the West were just disappearing. They felt they desperately needed a new outlet. And this matters a lot, because that philosophical anxiety completely collided with a massive economic reality. Thanks to the booming Industrial Revolution, the U.S. was suddenly producing goods at a completely unprecedented rate. By 1900, the total value of American exports had roughly tripled to a staggering $1.5 billion. To put that in perspective, the domestic market simply couldn't absorb everything the factories and farms were churning out. The nation was literally forced to seek out new global consumers. So the absolutely crucial point here is the concept of overproduction. The author argues that this looming economic crisis forced a rather unique agreement between the agrarian West, who needed to sell their crops, and the industrial East, who really needed to sell their manufactured goods. They both desperately needed foreign markets to avoid severe economic depressions. That shared need for global consumers, that is the primary root of the modern American empire. Moving right along to Section 2, defining modern imperialism and the methods of expansion. To actually secure those vital new markets in places like Latin America and Asia, the United States realized it had to join the established European powers in an age of imperialism. Now, the text defines imperialism essentially as a dynamic of power. It's what happens when a weaker people cannot manage their own domestic or foreign affairs simply out of fear of retaliation by an outside power. And to project that kind of global power and protect international commerce, you'll see military strategists like Alfred Mahan arguing that the U.S. desperately needed to modernize its Navy. Because, well, a global market requires a global military presence, right? As you read, notice how the U.S. didn't just use one single method to expand. We actually see two distinct flavors here. First, there's formal imperialism, which means direct military occupation and annexation, very much like traditional European-style colonialism. But then, there's informal, or soft imperialism, where control is maintained through economic dominance and political pressure without actually formally taking over the government. Definitely keep these two distinct methods in mind as you go through the text. Okay, on to Section 3, the imperial justifications, focusing on rhetoric and ideology. You might be wondering, how did Americans actually convince themselves that this aggressive expansion was the right thing to do? Pay close attention to how economic motives were often masked by highly paternalistic rhetoric. Leaders like Theodore Roosevelt aggressively argued for national greatness and martial prowess. Missionaries claimed it was their divine duty to spread Christianity. Others leaned heavily into social Darwinism and the deeply racist concept of the white man's burden, claiming they were bringing the blessings of civilization to backward peoples. And how did they usually do that? By turning them into consumers of American products, of course. Let's look at Section 4, ideals versus brutal realities, specifically in Cuba and the Philippines. A really common misconception is that the United States acted purely as a benevolent liberator during the Spanish-American War. But we can rigorously test that idea by contrasting the stated, idealized goals of entering the conflict with the actual historical outcomes on the ground in places like Cuba and the Philippines. Notice how these historical events connect. Before the war, the U.S. passed the Teller Amendment. This was an idealist promise that America would not annex Cuba and was fighting solely for Cuban independence. But Fast forward just a few years later, and that ideal was replaced by the Platt Amendment. This 1901 mandate basically gave the U.S. the right to intervene in Cuba's affairs and control its finances. So the ideal of true independence quickly morphed into the reality of soft imperialism, essentially turning Cuba into an American protectorate and a playground for investors. And over in the Philippines, the reality was even starker. Formal imperialism led directly to the Philippine-American War, which was a brutal overseas guerrilla conflict. This was absolutely not a peaceful transition. It resulted in the combat deaths of roughly 18,000 Filipinos, plus at least 100,000 more who perished from disease and famine directly related to the war.
This matters deeply because quotes like this one from an American newspaper correspondent in 1902 starkly expose the ugly truth. That idealized, civilizing mission we talked about earlier, it quickly evaporated, and in its place was the deployment of industrialized weaponry and just brutal repression against native peoples who simply wanted their own independence.
Which brings us to Section 5, Policing the Western Hemisphere and the Roosevelt Corollary. While the U.S. was pushing an open-door policy for equal trade access all the way over in China, its approach to its own hemisphere was, well, far more heavy-handed. President Theodore Roosevelt introduced his corollary to the Monroe Doctrine in 1904. This established the famous Big Stick policy. It meant the U.S. formally asserted the right to forcefully intervene in Latin America and the Caribbean to stabilize finances, collect debts, and, above all, keep European powers out. The U.S. was effectively appointing itself as the international police force of the Western Hemisphere. And this brings us to one of the most striking admissions you'll find in the text. U.S. Major General Smedley Butler, a highly decorated Marine, later bluntly admitted his role in these interventions. Calling himself a gangster for capitalism, his quote perfectly captures how these American military deployments were primarily designed to make the Caribbean safe for American banking, corporate agriculture, and oil interests. Notice how these seemingly isolated historical events connect to form a very clear pattern. From supporting the Panama Revolt to build the canal, to forced financial supervision in the Dominican Republic and Nicaragua, all the way to military intervention in Mexico. Through a combination of military force and strict financial control, American capital completely transformed the Caribbean basin into what became widely known as an American lake. All right, we made it to Section 6, Big Ideas to Remember, your pre-reading takeaways. Before you sit down to tackle the chapter yourself, I really want to summarize the largest historical themes you need to anchor in your mind. Keeping these 4 big ideas front and center will make all the specific battles, treaties, and historical figures in the text so much easier to digest, because you'll see exactly how they fit into the larger puzzle. Number 1. Domestic industrial overproduction drove a desperate need for foreign markets. Number 2, the U.S. utilized both formal and informal imperialism to secure those markets. Number 3, lofty, civilizing rhetoric often masked some pretty brutal realities on the ground. And number 4, the Roosevelt Corollary officially turned the U.S. into the financial and military police force of the Western Hemisphere. Finally, I want you to keep this provocative question in the back of your head as you read. How did the quest to solve domestic economic problems fundamentally transform America's entire identity on the world stage? Think about the cause and effect here, and consider how the legacy of this specific era continues to shape global dynamics even today. Enjoy the reading, students, and I'll see you in our next explainer.